The presenters for our next session are both from two very large community college districts in the state. I'm not sure who's going to speak first, but I'll introduce Diane Snyder is the Vice Chancellor for Finance Administration at Alamo College. She's been with Alamo College since 2008. Prior to that, she held positions at AT&T and Price Waterhouse. Diane is currently, Ben and Diane are both currently working on their doctorate degrees in the UT Austin higher education program. Ben is let's see, what's your title? Is the Executive Vice President for Finance and Administration at Austin Community College. Ben also held a similar position at Tyler Junior College. And let's see, Ben has over 25 years of experience in higher education. So they're going to talk about the budgeting process at their institutions, and if you have, and the practices that they use. If you have any questions, we do have a microphone, so if you'll hold your hand up if you have a question so that the recording can also get your question as well as their answer. Thank you.
So what we're going to talk to you about is focused on the budgeting side for community colleges. And because actually Ben and I had presented at a UT class together, and we thought it was a nice contrast between different methods, because every community college budgeting is an art. It's not a science. It's not the same everywhere. It really depends on your organizational structure, on what you're trying to incent and behavior. So all of those things come into play, so we're going to be contrasting that for you. So to start off, I want to hit some just key budget concepts, and then Ben is going to then talk briefly over some of the revenue, things that we look at during the budgeting process, and then we'll both contrast each of our budgeting methods. So on the budgeting concepts, the key thing is there is an annual budget process. It gets submitted to the state. It's available on the website. It's approved by the board. The concept of money follows mission, budget transparency, really making sure you put the money where your strategic goals are. That's a key part of the budgeting process. There's local policy decisions that are made at each institution. We both followed a modified zero-based budgeting approach, which that means unused funds at the end of the year are swept up. They don't roll over to be used the next year. You kind of start over each year. But there are some multiple year funds, such as construction. You may have your student activity fees, things that are restricted for certain purposes, that anything that's unused there does roll forward. So that's why we call it a modified zero base. On distribution methodologies, the two things that we're going to talk about is one approach might be more of a bottoms up, starting with an analysis of the prior year budget with overlays for cost savings and strategies. Another methodology that we use at Alamo colleges is a workload allocation model, to where we allocate the pool of money across our colleges based on the student volumes and facility costs based on facility metrics, et cetera. There's a local policy decision on whether you allow in each of your departments that money can be moved between line items in the budget. For instance, we allow it can be moved between non-labor accounts, but you can't move between labor and non-labor once the budget's been adopted without it coming through the main budget office. So those are local policy decisions. Contingencies. In your budgeting process, we have in our policy to where there is a small amount of 0.25% that is set up in the budget process by policy into an institutional reserve, a chancellor reserve, that allows, if you had something come up during the year, you could do minor movement budget out of this fund to put into someone's budget to fund something that may have been overlooked or some change in the process without it having to come all the way back to the board. So it gives a little discretion. Some people have that. Guidelines as far as other metrics that even once you set the budget that you watch these metrics, and Some of the things we do is focus on the percent of the personnel budget. So how much of our total dollars in the budget is in labor and benefits, that we try to manage that. So we allow discretion to really set up some of the distributions, but after that we always follow up and look at those metrics too, and we work it from both sides. Or average class size is another one. And there may be a pool that's established during the budgeting process for a strategic initiative. We did that several years ago for Student Success Fund, to be able to bring to scale some of the programs that we were doing at various ones of our institutions. So we put it all in one fund to make sure it was used only for those purposes. Some organizational differences that impact the budget methodologies utilized. For instance, on the Austin Community College, they follow a one college concept. They have 10 campuses. They're not separately accredited. It's under one accreditation. But they're organized with one president, one CEO, one set of administrators, one set of department chairs, and then resources assigned in a more functional basis across all their locations. When you contrast that to the Alamo colleges, we have 5 colleges and 12 off-campus sites that support the 8-county service area. We're individually accredited colleges. In Texas, the only institutions that are that way is Dallas and Alamo colleges. We have one chancellor, but we have 5 presidents, a president at each of the colleges. We have 5 vice chancellors, and then we have 3 vice presidents per college. So we have an organizational structure that's organized at a college level, and then 5 sets of department chairs and deans. And so that's why we adopted a workload allocation model, because as you have changes in your enrollment across the 5 colleges, you really want to make sure it follows where the students are. Some of the other things we do during the budgeting process is think long range, prepare long-term revenue and expense estimates. Just like we heard a minute ago, all the different revenue streams to focus on that, as well as your operational cost and your capital needs. Some of the revenue estimate questions that we have to step back and look big picture, because when we start the budget process, we don't know where we're going to be with state revenues. We don't know yet. You start with an estimate and then monitor as we go through the legislative cycle. So we're focused on what's happening at the national and state economy. You know, does it look like it's going to be a tight year at the state? Well, that's probably reading the tea leaves that we're probably going to get less of a pool. So you start planning, looking at some of those factors. You look at the sales tax revenues, are they up and down? You look at what's competing with us, Medicaid, social services. We look at our taxing district appraised value outlook to try to estimate, read the tea leaves there. Do we think the tax base is going to continue to grow so that your same tax rate would produce more money or not? And then what's going on with financial aid, and that could impact enrollment. Because if you have a significant part of your population that's on financial aid, and if there's cuts coming, then that could impact someone's ability on how many classes they can take. This is a quick snapshot, since we have our peer university colleges in another room, but this highlights the main differences between our public universities and our community colleges, and it's really on the facilities construction and operation. So for a public university such as UT, the state pays for their facilities. Community colleges, the state does not pay for the facilities. Not only do they not pay for the building construction and maintenance, but they also don't pay for the employees that do, like our housekeeping and all of those grounds. Those are ineligible employees when it comes to benefits, because the state does not fund the facilities. That has to come through a tax rate. So it's supported. We have the ability to have local taxes that supply that. On education in general, both of us get some state appropriations, and in theory is to keep our tuition and fees low. On the health and retirement benefits, at the public university, the state was pretty well funding it all. The change that was discussed earlier was a massive change for us about 4 years ago, where almost all of our employees were covered, not completely 100%, but close, to moving to this 50-50. I know for Alamo, that made a $10 million in 1 year difference, in addition to the cuts in the state appropriations that year of another $10 million. It was $20 million to swallow in about 3 months. So that's now locked in. So hopefully we won't be batting that around anymore, so the 50-50, so we can plan on that. The other main difference, of course, public universities have major athletic programs that provide big revenue, and some of the other differences you see on the bottom is more similar than different, though fundraising differs at every institution. And community colleges, ours is focused on scholarships for students. Some institutions may do fundraising for facilities also. And then to touch on the capital plan, there's various ways as a community college that you can fund your facilities needs. And we had built this chart several years ago for our board to help contrast what competes against our maintenance and operations, our regular operating money, versus what is through a regular debt tax rate that's separately voted on. So this table shows the general obligation bonds. It's funded by the tax levy or the debt levy. Thus, it doesn't compete with your operating budget. It is allowed to fund new construction as well as remodeling, but we'd have to go to the voters and have that specifically approved. Contrast that to revenue bonds. Say you're doing a parking garage, you might do revenue bonds. That's typically funded not through your debt tax rate, through your regular M&O tax rate, so it's going to compete with your regular operations, the funding for that. And it can fund new construction and remodeling also. There's maintenance tax notes that you can use either for. You can use debt or M&O. And so if you use the debt side, it doesn't impact your operating budget, but it is not allowed to be used for new construction. It's allowed to use for remodeling and renovation. So again, these are various decisions depending on the project you have. And then some of us have been starting to work on some public-private partnerships. I know Alamo College has built some dormitories, or San Antonio College, using that model, and that's where you partner with some other institution. You might do a library that's together with some other, an ISD or a joint partnership to where you're commonly funding it. So there are some options there. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben to touch on the revenues.
Thank you, Diane. I think we've already had a really good presentation on revenues, so we'll have a little bit of review, but also I think a couple of different perspectives on the long range. As Diane said, when you go to prepare your budget at Austin, I'm sure at all the colleges, you really want to look down the road because things might be fine for the next year or two, but there may be a cliff out there and you want to see it long before you get to it so you can take action. Of course, we've already heard, and it's so true, that the state appropriations are in constant decline, and I've got an interesting slide coming up on still where Texas is on that. Contact hours continue to drift down. The funding, you can see that dip, 10, 11, 12, 13 is in the the economic recession. It's bounced up a little bit, but this is an example of the contact hour trend analysis that we prepared at Austin and say, where's this going? Is it going to come back? This trend would indicate that no. I think, and so we dial that into our thinking and our long range, our short and long range estimates, saying this is probably not going to come back. So now we need to look at other things. On the cost side is how do we operate more efficiently? On the revenue side, the taxes, things like that. But let's stop depending too much on this, because when it gyrates, and it does a lot, then you may have had all the best laid plans in the world on what you're going to do. You're planning for your college in the future. Suddenly the economy tanks or something happens. You get a mid-year state cut, which we've had a lot of in the last several years, and suddenly it's off the table. And that means the state is basically your master long-range planner unless you figure out how to buffer against that. I think the red line is because these appropriations, and they're only about 20% of the budgets now and dropping, so we tend to talk about appropriations as if, well, that's our main source of money, and actually it's typically not anymore. We're saying it may be the party fund here before too long, but it does not fund growth in contact hour. In other words, if your enrollment goes up, it doesn't mean that your state appropriations based on that enrollment is going to come through proportionally. And also, it does not fund inflation. And the public universities tend to get a percentage in there for inflation. The community colleges do not. At one time, we thought, well, they do fund growth, it's just not inflation. But when we started to do this type of analysis, we said, no, none of it's being funded. This is tax rates. We've already talked about that. I would point out the state average is 16.5 cents, almost 16.6 cents. Our tax rate is capped at 9 cents. We're well below the state average, but our appraised values grow nicely, and that tends to float us. Every other district is going to be slightly different. These are your major urban districts. Their total levy, as you can see, Austin, we've got 117 million coming in, and that's up from 50 million in 2002 when I arrived. We've had some annexations, and the comptroller will come in once in a while and say, well, this area's taxes are too low. You need to raise your appraisal district values by X percent. And we've had a tax election that in 03 that added 4 cents to our 5 cent cap. A lot of colleges are not capped, or they have a much higher cap. We cannot raise our tax rate without going to the public and getting them to vote. We did just that the first week in November, and they said no. They were very good in approving the 2 bond issue propositions for $385 million, but they said no to our tax increase, which was 3 cents over 6 years. So, okay. This is I do that each year. I take the Chronicle of Higher Education, sort of our industry paper, and they have an almanac at the end of August, and I take that and I go through every state and say, what is your annual average tuition for your state for public 2-year community colleges, and I graph it. And I think you can see there, let's find Texas on here. Well, it's that burnt orange stripe way down on the right side. We're 3rd lowest in the United States on annual average tuition and fees for public community colleges. I think this has a lot to do with the state appropriation trend, because you can see all the other states, the tuition is much higher, and when you're fighting Medicaid and other things that are demanding a state's revenues, then we have other options such as taxes and tuition and fees, and so you see that reflecting. Some states, I believe, have gone down to near zero, such as Arizona, as far as state support for public 2-year colleges. This is just the large urban districts, their enrollment contact hour trends. We're all down a little bit, or almost all of us down a little bit, but I think what's important to remember, in the spring of '09, then we gained about 23% in enrollment, and we've been slowly giving that back, and now we're back to normal on the long-range trend analysis. So when people start saying the sky's falling, it says, no, we're just back to normal. The bubble was the big jump. Now, if it keeps going down, we may have a sea change going on, but as far as our college goes, I think as been said, every college is a little bit different, but this is how we tend to do this at Austin Community College, considered a very large urban district. I can assure you that it's surprisingly similar to Tyler Junior College, where I came from. I was there 13 years, and they did it very much the same. So I brought a lot of the stuff I did. They already had a good process at Austin Community College. But the point is, I think whether you're a large institution or a small institution, these principles are generally the same. We do a lot of master planning, and it's developed by the president and the college staff at all levels. It considers the educational needs, what's going on with the state, and our capital needs. We're growing at Austin, and so we look long range, and I'm like 20, 30, 40 years based on the state demographer's numbers and say, what kind of capacity do we need to think about today for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and where is that going to be? And that's how we develop our capital plan. We develop a budget that is based on that plan, and what the president and the trustees get together and decide what are our initiatives this year, so that we can give guidance to the departments how to support that, rather than just ask for a letter to Santa where everybody's expected to pile in a lot of budget requests for new initiatives, and you really don't accomplish much. So we have a few guiding things set by the trustees and the president. We develop a budget supported by that, and then the board approves both the master plan for the year and the budget. This is a picture of the process. It's pretty elaborate, but basically it says the same thing as we start with our annual review of the master plan, and that rolls into our budget process, and we end up with a budget process, a budget that's related to the master plan, which is, sometimes that can be rare. We do a bottom-up, and I've learned the hard way that a bottom-up budget process is far safer than a top-down one. You hear stories of the CFO goes into his office, shuts the door, and comes out with a budget. Well, I've seen that blow up schools, literally. Well, not literally, but it's much safer for the departments to come up. They know their budgets better than anybody. We do tell our people that a couple things are going to happen. You can talk to us in the business office, but you can move around. If you know you're not going to fill this position and it's February and you need it for something else, then use it. But at the end of the year, it's going to snap back to the grid. And we do not sweep their butt. We don't sweep the leftovers. We do take it to fund balance, but we say if you didn't spend all your money in your department this year, that's a good thing. That's fine. It's not going to hurt you. I don't want them dumping their budgets in August because they're worried about next year. So it'll go back to where it was before, so don't dump your money if you end up with a balance. That's great. It benefits the entire college. And that works a lot better because you don't get the games going on. Also, say in mid-year, and I say February because that's after the spring semester enrollment has occurred and you know what your adjunct budget or your part-time faculty budget is. Sometimes if there's balances, we'll go over with the departments and say, look, you have this much left over. You're projected to have this much at the end of the year. Is there something you can do this year that you really need that will make it so you don't have to add it to next year's budget? We're trying to keep next year's budget flat or as near this year as we can. And sometimes there's some horse trading amongst the various areas, and it's an efficient way to use the money. Of course, you have your execs sitting there and saying, okay, do you really need that? Do we really want to do that? Is that in the master plan? But that's a good way to keep the pressure off of next year's budget and use your money wisely in the current year. It works up from the departments through the instructional administration, finally to the president, and then after it's vetted at each level, it's presented to the trustees to approve the total budget. We do long range. This goes out to 2030 because we run out of paper on the right usually. But you can see at the bottom levels are our predictions on tuition and fees, the green line, district taxes, our expenses at the top are the blue line, and we say the revenues are just ahead of the expenses. We want to maintain a slight 2 to 3% revenue, net revenue at the end of the year. And then the appropriations we've flattened those actually, which is pretty optimistic on our part, and we know that. But that's a good look at, based on our policies, what we think's long range, and then we watch it like a hawk and adjust it each month actually. This is what we present to the budget we present to the Board of Trustees, and the President is summarized, but it's summarized in ways that are intuitive, that you can understand. You have We show the revenues at the top of tuition and fees, and then the various other sources, state appropriations, taxes. Show the current budget, the changes in it, and then what the proposed budget will be, and then we go through several iterations in the spring. We want the trustees, and so the president and the trustees, to certainly understand every step of the budget process and what's happening with what line and why. And then we show the same thing in the expense side, all the expenses, mostly by function are over here, like payroll, faculty salaries, not by instruction, something too high level, and show the changes in that. And this is that long range. This is a long range projection that actually our policies require, that shows, based on your policies today and current estimates of revenues and expenses and inflation, what it's going to look like for the next out through 2024. And if we say the effect is going to come from tuition increases, what those need to be over a long period of time. So when we go to our board and say, hey, we need $3 in tuition this year, it's off that chart to maintain long range those policies that the board has set. And that's, I've seen where there's a $20 million wall at the third year out. We were just showing the 2 years. This really does a good job in knowing long-term what your stability looks like. So that's how we do it at Tyler, Austin. Sorry, you know, go Apaches. But you know, I found when I got to Austin, all I had to really do was add another 0 or 2, and everything else was the same. In fact, I said, you guys don't have any problems here at Austin. We have dormitories, and we have 10 sports, men's and women's sports. So this is easy here. It's commuter school. So actually, I love Austin, but I do have an affinity for the, you know, the smaller schools and rural things and the great things they do too. So, Diane?
All right, thank you. All right. I'm going to show you how we approach budgeting at Alamo Colleges. And one of the things we adopted a few years ago, we labeled it BAM for the budget alignment methodology. And it was really some of the things that are very common with what Austin does, and I think most of our colleges do, which is do that long-range planning and really come up and identify with the challenge early and talk about it. Also align our budget with the strategic priorities, and then for those strategic things we're going to do, project manage them. Make sure you accomplish them and you report back on how you're doing, because you're counting on it and you built it into your budget up front. And then some ongoing cycles of improvement. So when I talk about identifying the challenge, when we had that huge challenge back in the summer of 2010 with that $20 million and a few months to cure it, when the state decided to cut the benefits and our appropriations so quickly, we did a lot of messaging internally with our employees, as well as with the community, to make sure they understood that we needed their help to try to help us cover the gap. Our 10-year forecast, this is a graphic view we share with our board that has detailed models behind it that really looks at what we were considering our worst case view, which was the fixed pool of state appropriation dollars, if that went down 3% at the same time we were growing. So this was one of our views that would say a worst case view, what would we have to do to react? And we really looked at it as a balanced approach. So we cannot do it just through tuition and fees because we need to stay affordable for our students. And taxes, we're always reluctant on taxes. We try to tie it to our facility needs. And so we know we also have to do it on efficiencies. And so we report out on cost savings or strategies to where we can try to bring our expense structure down to live within that revenue stream. Our second step is really the piece I wanted to highlight to you, which is doing a workload budget allocation. And then on top of that, then we've done some strategic investments we may want to do that align to some goals that we have. So when we do our workload budget allocations, first thing is we model actually our revenues separate from our expense. We just go ahead and create a baseline view. Don't want to hide it, don't want to force it to balance. We want to share the ugly pressure so that it's really very transparent. If we're going to have a high challenge year where our revenue streams will come way down, we're going to still have the enrollment that we expect and what's the cost structure to support that enrollment. If that creates a gap, we talk about it, and then we talk about what we're going to do about closing that gap. So in the revenues, of course, estimating the taxes, the state in this next cycle will be monitoring for months the House and Senate view, trying to model worst case views. And then tuition and fees, various scenarios. On the non-formula revenues, because those are formula-based, our non-formula are things where we have, now this is still old, we're at 33 programs that are high-cost programs that we actually do special program tuition for, things like nursing, our aviation program, to where we're still the best deal in town as far as what students would have to pay if they went anywhere else. But we model those and we set whichever of our 5 colleges has that program. Once the revenues are estimated, we give them the expense that goes with it. So that's why I call it, it's outside the student count. It's really based on the program level. We also do continuing education contracts. We estimate what we're going to be doing in continuing education that may not be equal across our 5 colleges. So that's what makes it the non-formula. It goes where the program is. And then other miscellaneous. On the expense side, this is the 7th year we've been doing this, and we work very tightly with our VP of College Services at each of the colleges, the budget officers, and the chief budget office to really, that entire model that we use to drive how much money goes to each college as a pool of money. We do this in basically a detailed model that looks at all of these various metrics. Lately, we've been modeling it flat on headcount and contact hour. We used to forward fund the growth, but then we had to take money away if it didn't happen. And we had that a couple years. So now what we've started to our colleges that we're going to model it flat, but then if fall comes in higher than planned, we amend the budget in the November, December timeframe. We use key metrics that drive how much money a college gets. It's primarily driven by contact hours. That determines how many instructors do you need, then what's the average cost for the instructors, what's the other costs that go with it. We also model for a 50-50 ratio of full-time to part-time faculty, so that cost structure is applied. Even if an individual college may not be quite at the goal, the workload model fairly distributes money based on the key targets, so it incents the behavior to get to the targets that were set as an institution. And then we add money for the student support services. We look at our cost structure. We tie it to audited financial statement numbers on a cost per contact hour, or cost per student if we're in student services, that it's very transparent. So when we work with the colleges, this was a huge improvement because years ago, colleges that spend a lot tend to get more. And so when we have multiple individually accredited colleges, and we had some older colleges that were pretty established and maybe flattening a little bit, and then we had a high growth new college, we didn't have the money to grow that new college. So that's what led us to workload. Drive it to where the students is, you get a pool of money, and the output of the model results in a single number. Then we allow the colleges, decentralized, to actually determine all the positions they're going to load, make the decisions local on how much they're going to give to tutoring, what they're going to do to each of their programs, as long as they balance to the total. We allow them to load it. So it's kind of a win-win that allows us to distribute the pool of money based on where the students are, but then allow the colleges to control the detailed load of all of the programs and departments, as long as it ties together. I won't go through all of this. This is some of the key assumptions that we use in the model. It is modeled by each of the disciplines, so not every instructional program has the same cost structure or has the same class size. This year we actually improved it to set our target average class size, district-wide as an average, is 25. It was adopted back in 2010 as a cost-saving strategy. But some programs may only be 10. It depends on the program. So we actually worked with our VPs of academic success and set granular targets for classroom, lab, and clinical for each of the 28 disciplines, and then ran it against a full year's contact hours to say, based on these targets, do we get to our 25? So we reached an agreement that allowed us to operationalize those differences, and then each college has a different mix of programs, so their average class size may be slightly different based on those targets. Even in our operations and maintenance, we assign how many people for housekeeping, for grounds, for maintenance based on ratio. Our utilities, we look at consumption and the rates to estimate that. And then the final piece in the workload allocation part that we do is similar to what Ben was talking about. You want to incent behavior at the end of the year that people don't just spend it because they got it. We had a couple years where I heard people that were buying rooms full of paper because they had budget money, and they thought next year that would save them some money if they filled up a room now. So we put this policy to incent behavior that allows any net savings at each president or vice chancellor for a given year, the net savings from budget that they don't spend. 25% allows to stay with them and be in a fund that can accumulate for a few years that they could use for special purpose. And the 75%, the reason that remains going back to the fund balance is because we've been heavily investing about $10 million a year in some investments. And so we need this underspend to accumulate to be for those district-wide purposes. Our strategic investments have been in three main areas: of course, student success strategies, our operations and systems, and then employee development. One thing that we started highlighting this year, and I bring it up because you may run into the same thing, your budget is an estimate every year on what you think is going to happen. If you always look at this year's budget compared to last year's budget, you could have elephants passing in the night, because the reality of what really happened, your very first step in the new budget, is you got to true up to actuals. And we used to have people that would try to pick our budget because, well, why did this college get more money, or why did this one, not get enough, without taking that pit stop through of, oh, well, they estimated that year they were going to get a lot of growth. It didn't happen. So the next year budget starts first with truing up based on volumes, then determining, are we going to grow, build that in, and then the final piece is kind of net investments. So we started preparing this to take that noise out of this budget-to-budget comparison. That could be very helpful. I won't go through all of these. All of our investments in fiscal year 15 amounted to almost $11 million after reversing the one-time savings. Again, we're doing some really big investments on the pathways, the institutes, advising, to move to a case management, intrusive advising model, monitored academic progress with early alerting tools. So we're doing a lot of investment right now, and that's represented in these numbers. And then the final piece I wanted to touch on is something that Ben had mentioned in his. Since he starts bottoms up method, he has all the departments engaged in preparing that budget. What we do is we work with the senior leadership of these budget departments during the budget development of the model. But then we know we need to have a really strong communication plan to make sure others within the district really know what's in the numbers. So we supplement it with a communications plan. So our budget committee, that group of people that has the VPs of college services and the budget officers, they regularly meet during development. They all have access to the model. They can proof every cell. They can ask questions. Everyone, the feedback we've gotten is just loves the fact that it's just the math. Where's the students? I get my fair share. It's not the politics of what did I spend in prior year. We have Board of Trustee budget all-day retreats. In November, we just had ours, which starts looking at fiscal year 16, looking at revenue and strategic initiatives review. In July, we do an all-day looking at every little nit-nat to make sure that the board is fully aware of all of the different components of the budget outside of regular board meetings, so they have the time to really understand all the moving pieces. But the part that we've added this year is to include an opportunity for college town halls. We've done that in the past a few years ago, but our chief budget officer went and held budget sessions at each of the colleges to be able to talk about the model, how does it work, make sure they understand that we do a workload allocation that outputs a number. I've had people approach me at a board meeting, say from one of the colleges, and say, well, why did you not give me as much money in tutoring? And they were at a college. thinking it happened at the district level. And again, I would refer them to talk to their VP because we allow those decisions to happen locally. And I think that's been very, very helpful to really keep it where it's closer to the front lines. But we have to explain it to people so they understand. And then we do our budget book. Everyone has to publish that December 1st. It has to be available online. This is the 4th year we've had the Government Finance Association's Distinguished Budget Award. What that allows us to do is we've done a lot of effort to add to our budget. If you want to go out and look at ours, not only does it have the basic numbers, it's a communication device. It gives information on our debt. It gives information on, it's a policy, all of our policies, the actual board minute orders that support that budget adoption or various components, a financial plan. So it does have a lot of really good communications, and as a result, we've gotten that award. But I think it's been helpful for us to have a good communications tool. And then the final piece, those strategic initiatives that I didn't go through in detail, but part of it is we have to assign ownership, and we have to make sure we're tracking how we're doing on implementing it. So when the board gives us money for these investments, we've got to report back and make sure there's ownership. It's not some vague concept that's in a budget. And some of the ongoing improvement cycles that we had in our original design is we have an Alamo Ideas program that has an incentive component. We also have we use Baldrige for the Alamo Way, which is really looking at a systematic way of looking at our processes. Student success focus, a policy, as well as many of our investments being lined up to that. And then one piece that's maybe different just because we have the multiple colleges, we use a staffing management plan that looks at ratios by function, so that allows us when one college says, hey, I need this, or I need an English professor. Before we just rush out and hire in our structure, which is individually accredited, we can look across and say, well, volumes have declined. We could actually move a faculty member from one of our other colleges, or we could move a staff member. So we do have these reports that allow us to look at how we can reallocate, and that's also helped us on cost savings. So in summary, it's a two-step process. We run the workload allocation model. We overlay strategic initiatives. It outputs a single number for each of our colleges. The step 2, decentralized. They then load in dollars to their priorities and their departments and their employee positions. We supplement that by looking at some of our key metrics of average class size, percent labor, to make sure that whatever gets loaded, we still try to manage to be in our most flexible environment. The last piece we'll wrap up, Ben and I had put together a slide of just when you step back and look at the big picture planning and budgeting as a trustee, we'd recommend these are the questions you'd want to be asking. And these probably are not all, but it's just some. What's the board's budget policies? Be familiar with what's in the policies itself. Do we have a master plan that includes facilities needs? I didn't talk a lot about that on ours. We also do a similar process, demographic studies, long-term planning, and master plan documents across our campuses. Is the budget tied to the master plan and strategic plan? So that we really look at, if we said this is important to us in our strategic plan, is that where we're putting our funding? How does our budget process work and its timelines? The methodology decision for your institution. What are the long-range implications of today's decisions? It's like we talked about. You don't want to run over that cliff 2 years from now. You want to plan for it. You may not want to do a massive tuition increase all in 1 year. You may want to do a little bit at a time. That may be a strategy because you've got to get that funding stream to mitigate maybe some losses elsewhere. So that long-term planning is critical. And then are your practices fiscally sustainable long-term? Again, just looking at the bottom line. Does it make sense? Is your expenses continuing to spike and your revenues declining? You got to look at it because you're creating this imbalance, and you got to make sure you have a plan. So we'll open it to questions. Way too many numbers, I'm sure.
Ben, on your slide, you were showing us something we've all gotten used to, and that's that downward state. What I'm wondering is, it's almost like we're totally accepting that's it. And I'm hoping yet, though, that we're still fighting and trying to change that, and I'm not hearing anything of that. But especially in the last 6 months, I've heard more legislators acknowledge that they're finally understanding the role of community colleges when it might be a good time to push for those funds, not just say, hey, this is the way it is, we're stuck. Can you
Right.
comment?
Right. I think from a fiscal aspect, we want to say, well, what's it look like? And anything we are able to do down at the Capitol to improve that will just make things better. And that's come up before that quite well. You're just giving up. Says, no, but I'm going to be very, very realistic, conservative on the budgeting long range, because I can know it will get better. It'll either do this or it'll get better. Let's do all we can through our organizations to get it better. Also you look back and say, well, what else has the state got to deal with? And when you see some of the structural issues that the state's dealing with, and they know that, and you've heard this at the Capitol, I'm sure, as well as I have, says, well, if we don't give them money, people die. If we don't give you money, you can raise tuition, and we're the lowest. And so it's a balance there, but certainly we don't quit trying to keep our appropriations steady or increasing.
And one thing I would add to that is I had the privilege to serve on that coordinating board, formula funding committee. And I know this year we tried to work really hard and to build in a little bit more persuasive content into the ask that goes to the legislature to really, like Ben mentioned before, community colleges never asked for inflation. We just never had it. So we really tried to make the relationship of the cuts from the state versus the impact to tuition and fees. We're a three-legged stool, so it's not, if they're going to cut, it's going to come from somewhere. And our taxes, even if you take it all the way to the max, cannot fill that void. The only real place you can get is tuition and fees. And so we showed through, over time, what that impact. In the same year, they were saying, we want the $10,000 degree, but that's the year they cut us both on benefits and funding. They're incompatible. So we tried to be more persuasive with that information, and I also think there's a great effort from the Texas Association of Community College, all the presidents here, that organization, the trustee organization, to really get out and have those conversations long before the legislative cycle starts with the legislators to make sure they understand the importance of community colleges, that we play a unique role. So I wouldn't say we're ignoring that. We're asking for it, and the numbers this year are big, asking to take us to fund that in order to keep us more affordable and play that role. But for budgeting purposes, the accountant side of us is always going to run the worst case view, because you don't want to start a budget year and then start pulling back money when you've already hired people. So in a budgeting, we tend to look at a worst case, but then yes, I know everyone's working to improve the story and the persuasiveness of why the funding for the state is important.
We have one more question.
Yeah, and I really like your idea of looking at a per student ratio type thing in there. But one of the things we're coming up with is, in some of our technical programs, we're not competing salary-wise with private industry for those people to teach those classes. And that in itself makes, say, a technical course more expensive to teach on a per hour basis than what an academic type course would be. Your thoughts on maybe we've looked at several things, but maybe a sliding scale for those classes so you have a different rate per hour?
Well, what we did instead was we call those our high-cost programs, those 30 programs. Most of them were the technical programs or nursing, allied health programs, to where there's heavy equipment. Some of it is also salary. To get the qualifications we need to teach the nursing program, we had to do a stipend to really try to compete. And so there's higher cost, and we do pass that on to students as a special program tuition if they sign up for those programs. Now, when we said it, high cost isn't the only way we determine if it's going to qualify. It has to have a job demand where anyone coming out of that program pretty well can get hired somewhere. There's an immediate demand. So we do try to not just balance the cost, but also look at that it's a demand occupation. with a wait list to get in, and that we're still, even with the numbers we set, we're competitive on the rates versus other institutions that provide that training.
And we've looked at that several times to say, should we, and I think all the colleges, you know, your transfer, high seat courses support your workforce. And do we want to change how much we're charging the workforce? And we've looked at it and it got says, well, a lot of times, those are the very populations that we don't want to really add any financial burden to. So let's don't do that right now. Because some of those courses, you well know, would look like Harvard if we really laid the difference off and every pot on its own bottom, as they say. But we keep an eye on that, and we know other colleges are doing it too.